The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, and by Friday, Evelyn Vaughn was on a train headed somewhere she had never heard of, carrying a single leather trunk and the remnants of a reputation that her family had decided was not worth salvaging. She had not cried when her mother handed her the ticket. She had not cried when her father refused to come down from his study to say goodbye. She had not even cried when her younger sister, sweet-faced and sorry-eyed, pressed a small silver locket into her palm and whispered that she would write every week, knowing full well that their parents would intercept every letter. Evelyn Vaughn had simply picked up her trunk, walked out the front door of the Vaughn family home in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and climbed into the waiting carriage without looking back even once. She was 24 years old. She was educated, well-read, and had once been engaged to a man named Gerald Holt, who was the son of a banking magnate and who had, 7 weeks before their scheduled wedding, been caught in circumstances that made the engagement impossible to continue. The scandal, as these things so often did, had landed squarely on Evelyn rather than on Gerald, because Gerald's father had more money than God, and because society in Philadelphia in the year 1882 had very particular ideas about which parties in a broken engagement deserved sympathy. Evelyn had been quietly, efficiently, and completely ruined, and so her family had decided that the kindest thing, the most sensible thing, was to send her west, to a small town in the Texas panhandle called Caldwell Creek, where her father's distant cousin operated a boarding house and where no one would know the name Vaughn, and where Evelyn could simply disappear into the landscape and stop being a problem. That had been the word her father used, problem. She had heard him say it through the closed door of his study while he spoke to her mother the night before she left. She had stood in the hallway in her nightgown with her hand pressed flat against the wood of the door, and she had heard him call her a problem, and she had decided, very quietly and very firmly, that she would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her weep about it. The train ride west took 4 days. Evelyn sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the country change outside the window, the green of Pennsylvania giving way to the wide flat brown of the plains, the sky growing taller and more overwhelming the further west they traveled, until by the time the train pulled into Amarillo, it felt like the sky was the whole world and the earth was just an afterthought beneath it. She transferred to a stagecoach in Amarillo, and that was where things began to go wrong. The stagecoach driver, a sun-baked, leathery man named Pollard who smelled strongly of tobacco, informed her that the road to Caldwell Creek was passable, but that it was also a full day's ride, and that she was, as far as he could tell, the only passenger. Evelyn climbed in without complaint. She was not someone who complained about practical inconveniences. She saved her complaints for things that actually mattered, and they had been building up inside her for 4 days with nowhere to go. The stagecoach rattled west for approximately 3 hours before a wheel cracked on a dry creek crossing. Pollard climbed down and assessed the damage with the grave expression of a man who had seen this before and found it tiresome. He told Evelyn that the wheel would need to be repaired and that he would have to ride back to Amarillo for parts, and that she should sit tight in the shade of the creek and not wander because there were rattlesnakes. Then he took the horses and left. Evelyn sat in the shade of the overturned stagecoach and looked at the landscape around her. It was enormous. It was sandy and grass-covered and absolutely still in the afternoon heat, and it smelled like dust and something dry and faintly sweet that she could not identify. The sky was the color of a blue plate she had once owned. There was not a single building or person visible in any direction. She reached into her trunk, which had been unloaded onto the ground before Pollard rode off, and she pulled out a book she had been reading, a collection of essays by Thomas Huxley, and she opened it and began to read, because there was absolutely nothing else to do, and because sitting quietly and reading was something she was very good at. She read for 2 hours. The sun moved. Her back began to ache. She had eaten nothing since early morning and had only a small canteen of water that was growing warm in the heat. It was in the middle of her 3rd hour of patient, solitary waiting that she heard hoofbeats. She looked up from her book and shaded her eyes with her hand, and she saw a man on a horse coming across the plain from the south at an easy lope. He was not Pollard. She could see that from 100 yards. He was taller in the saddle, and he rode the way people who have spent their whole lives on horses ride, with a loose and easy confidence that looked like it had never been taught but simply grown that way. He pulled up his horse about 20 feet from the wrecked stagecoach and looked at the broken wheel and then at Evelyn, sitting in the shade with her book open in her lap. He had dark hair and dark eyes and a face that had been weathered brown by years of sun, and he was wearing a worn canvas jacket over a blue shirt and a hat that had seen considerable use. He was somewhere around 30, she judged, though the sun made it difficult to be certain. He looked at the stagecoach, then at her, then at the stagecoach again. "Wheel gave out," he said. "It was not a question." "Yes," Evelyn said. "The driver went back to Amarillo for parts." "How long ago?" "Approximately 3 hours." He pushed his hat back slightly and looked at the sun's position in the sky, calculating something. "He won't make it back before dark," he said. "Maybe not even by morning, depending on how the parts situation stands in Amarillo." Evelyn closed her book. She was not precisely alarmed. She was, however, extremely hot and hungry, and she had spent 4 days on a train and 3 hours on a stagecoach, and she had been sitting in the Texas dirt for 3 more hours, and she admitted to herself, at the absolute limit of her considerable patience. "Is there somewhere nearby I could wait indoors?" she asked. The man looked at her for a moment. He had the kind of face that gave nothing away quickly, not unfriendly, but contained, like someone who had learned to take his time before committing to an expression. "I've got a ranch about 4 miles south," he said. "Nothing fancy, but it's got walls and a roof and food." "That sounds precisely fancy enough," Evelyn said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile but the territory adjacent to one. "I'm Ira Brooks," he said. "I run the Double B out south of Caldwell Creek." "Evelyn Vaughn," she said. "I'm trying to reach Caldwell Creek." He nodded as if this was sensible information. He climbed down from his horse, a big gray animal with calm eyes, and helped her to her feet, and then they worked together to get her trunk secured with rope behind his saddle. He helped her up onto the horse first, then swung up behind her, and they rode south across the plain toward his ranch, while the afternoon sun burned orange above them, and the grass moved in a warm, steady wind. She sat stiffly at first, very aware of the fact that she was sharing a saddle with a complete stranger, holding the saddle horn with both hands while he held the reins with his arms on either side of her. But the horse moved smoothly, and after a while the stiffness began to drain out of her spine simply because the alternative was uncomfortable, and she relaxed by degrees, watching the landscape open up around them. "What's in Caldwell Creek?" he asked. His voice was closer than she was accustomed to from strangers. "A boarding house," she said. "My father's cousin runs it. Her name is Me Draper." "I know Me," he said. "Good woman. You know her well enough. She runs the only boarding house in 3 counties. You get to know people like that." Evelyn considered this. "What kind of town is Caldwell Creek?" she asked. She had formed an impression from the name alone, something cramped and dusty and provincial, but she was aware that impressions formed at a distance of 2,000 miles were not always reliable. "Honest kind," he said. "About 400 people. Grain merchants, a couple of saloons, a doctor, a school. Church on Sunday. Not much happens there that shouldn't." "That sounds remarkably decent," she said, and meant it more than he probably knew. The Double B came into view from a low rise, a collection of buildings set against a line of cottonwood trees that ran along what must have been a creek. There was a main house, low and wide and built from adobe and timber, and several outbuildings, a barn, a bunkhouse, and what appeared to be a smokehouse. The whole place had the look of something that had been built by hand, piece by piece, over a long time, and cared for consistently since. There were 3 or 4 ranch hands visible in and around the barn, and they looked up without much curiosity as Ira rode in with a woman in city clothes sharing his saddle. "Don't mind them," he said. "They've seen stranger things." He helped her down from the horse and called over a young hand named Pete to see to the animal and the trunk, and then he walked her into the main house. The interior was plain and clean and larger than the outside had suggested. There was a main room with a stone fireplace and a wooden table large enough for 6, a kitchen beyond it, and what appeared to be 3 doors leading to other rooms. The floor was hardwood, smooth and dark with use. There were shelves with books on them, more books than she had expected, and a lamp on the table and curtains at the windows that were plain cream muslin but clean and pressed. "I'll get you some water," he said. "There's food from earlier. It won't be anything worth writing home about." "I haven't had anything since morning," she said. "I will happily eat anything you have." He disappeared into the kitchen, and Evelyn stood in the main room and looked at the books on the shelves. She read the spines. There was a Bible and a legal text on land claims and a history of Texas and several novels, and a battered copy of Darwin's On the Origin of Species and a geology survey from 1879, and a volume of poetry by Walt Whitman. She heard him moving in the kitchen, the sound of a pot being set on a stove, water being poured. She pulled out the Whitman and turned it over in her hands. The spine was cracked with use. He came back with a pitcher of water and a cup and set them on the table. He saw the book in her hands. "You read Whitman?" she asked. "In the evenings," he said, "when there's time." "Which is your favorite?" she asked. He considered. "Song of the Open Road," he said without hesitation, and something in her chest shifted very slightly, the way a window shifts when someone opens it and lets in air. She ate cold cornbread and beans that he warmed on the stove, sitting at the big wooden table while the evening light came through the west-facing windows and turned everything golden. He sat across from her with coffee and was quiet, but it was not the uncomfortable quiet of someone who had run out of things to say. It was the quiet of someone who was comfortable being quiet and comfortable letting someone else be quiet too. She had spent 4 days surrounded by the noise of a train and the noise of her own thoughts and the loud, insistent silence of people who had decided she was not worth the trouble of a proper goodbye. And this quiet, this specific quiet, was something entirely different. She noticed that he noticed her, not in a rude way, in the careful way of someone who is paying attention. "You didn't ask why I'm going to Caldwell Creek to stay at a boarding house," she said. "Not my business," he said. "Most people would ask. Most people could stand to mind their own business more than they do," he said. She looked at him across the table. "I was sent west," she said. "My family. They decided I had become inconvenient and this was the solution." He held her gaze steadily. "That's a hard thing to do to someone," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He didn't offer her any of the useless consolations she had been bracing for. It was for the best. They must have had reasons. Family knows what's right. He just agreed that it was hard and left the space around that agreement open, and she found that she was grateful for it in a way that she felt behind her ribs. She slept in one of the back rooms, a small, clean space with a narrow bed and a quilt in a pattern of blue and white squares, while the ranch sounds settled outside into the sounds of a Texas night, which were vast and filled with crickets and the distant call of something she could not identify, and she lay awake for a while looking at the ceiling and thinking that she had expected to feel smaller when she arrived in the West. She did not feel smaller. She felt, for the first time in quite a long while, like exactly the size she actually was. Pollard returned the following afternoon with a repaired wheel and considerable apology, and Evelyn packed her things and thanked Ira Brooks for his hospitality, and climbed back into the stagecoach for the remaining hour's ride into Caldwell Creek. He stood in the yard and watched the stagecoach leave. She did not let herself look back until the stagecoach had gone 100 yards, and then she did look back, through the small rear window, and he was still standing there in the yard with his hat in his hand and the sun behind him. She faced forward again and told herself that she had more important things to think about. Mee Draper was a short, solid woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and quick dark eyes, and the manner of someone who had been efficiently managing other people's inconveniences for so long that she had come to find it genuinely satisfying. She met the stagecoach in front of the boarding house, a two-story frame building on the main street of Caldwell Creek, and she took one look at Evelyn and said, "You look like the train was unkind to you." "The train was fine," Evelyn said. "The stagecoach wheel broke." Typical. Me took her trunk as if it weighed nothing. "Come inside. I'll put you in the room at the back. It's quieter and it gets the morning sun." The boarding house had 6 rooms and 5 current boarders, and a kitchen that smelled perpetually of bread and coffee. Me ran it with the precision of someone who had built the whole operation herself, which she had. Her husband Thomas had died of fever in 1874, leaving her with a half-built house and no income. And she had simply finished building the house and started renting rooms, and had never mentioned being afraid of any of it, because being afraid was not the same as not doing the thing. Over supper that first night, a long table with 7 people around it, since me ate with her boarders, Evelyn met the other residents. A grain merchant named Haskell who talked too much about crop futures, 2 brothers named Clay and Denton who worked at the livery stable and spoke almost exclusively to each other, a schoolteacher named Miss Prudence Cole who had come west from Ohio for reasons she was vague about, and a retired cattle drover named Old Sam who ate enormous quantities of everything and said almost nothing. Evelyn said very little herself. She listened. She had always been a good listener, which was one of the things that had made people underestimate her in Philadelphia, because people who were quiet were frequently assumed to have nothing going on behind the quiet, when often the opposite was true. After supper, she helped me clear the dishes, and me watched her with those quick dark eyes and said, "Your father wrote to me." "I imagined he would have," Evelyn said. "He said you needed a quiet place to settle down and recover your sensibilities." Evelyn stacked the plates with care. "He meant he needed me somewhere out of sight." Me was quiet for a moment, washing a pot. "I know what he meant," she said. "I also know that I make my own judgments about the people in my house, and your father's letter doesn't count for much in my kitchen." She looked at Evelyn directly. "What do you need?" Evelyn had not been asked that question in a very long time. She thought about it honestly. "Work," she said. "Something useful to do. I'll go mad sitting in a room." "Can you teach?" me asked. "I have a full education," Evelyn said, "and I've taught my younger sister since she was 7. Miss Cole needs someone to help with the younger grades," me said. "She's got 30 children in one room, and she's been struggling since the Hendricks family sent all 5 of their boys this fall. I can speak to her tonight if you're willing." "Tonight," Evelyn said immediately. Me smiled. It was a small smile, but a real one. "Good," she said. "That's settled then." Within a week, Evelyn had a routine. She rose early and helped me with breakfast, then walked 3 blocks to the small wooden schoolhouse and spent the morning with the younger children while Miss Cole managed the older ones. The Hendricks boys were exactly as chaotic as advertised, but they were also genuinely curious, and Evelyn had always found curiosity, even chaotic curiosity, easier to work with than indifference. She ate lunch with the children and came back in the afternoon and helped them with reading, which most of them found tedious, and she found a way to make it less so by reading to them from books that had adventure in them, and the numbers in her afternoon sessions began to climb. She wrote no letters to Philadelphia. She had decided, firmly and without drama, that if her family wanted to reach her they knew where she was, and if they did not reach her then she would live her life in Caldwell Creek and not spend any more of her energy pointing herself in a direction that was not interested in her. She thought about Ira Brooks more than she would have liked to admit. Not in a way she could have clearly articulated. More like the way a thought comes back to you, the memory of his voice saying "not my business," the way he'd said the line from Whitman without hesitating, the cover of the book worn soft with use. Small things, but they came back with a persistence that she chose to interpret as simple curiosity about an interesting person rather than anything more complicated. She encountered him for the second time 3 weeks after her arrival. She had walked to the general store on a Saturday morning to buy a notebook. She had taken to writing in the evenings, not letters, just thoughts. the kind of writing you do when you need to get the inside of your head a little quieter. And she was coming out of the store when she nearly walked directly into Ira Brooks, who was coming in. They both stopped on the boardwalk in front of the store, and there was a moment of mutual recognition that was, she noticed, slightly warmer than pure surprise. "Miss Vaughn," he said, "Mr. Brooks, you made it to Caldwell Creek all right." "I did. Me Draper has been very good to me." He nodded. He was carrying a list in one hand, supplies she imagined, the kind of list a working ranch generated weekly. He looked at the notebook she had just purchased. "You write?" he asked. "I'm finding I do," she said. "What do you write about?" She considered. "Mostly what I see, observations, the landscape, the children I teach." "You're teaching at the schoolhouse, helping Miss Cole with the younger grades." Something shifted in his expression, not dramatically. Just a fractional adjustment, like a lens coming into focus. "That's good work," he said. "The school has needed help for a while. So I discovered." They stood on the boardwalk for a moment while the Saturday commerce of Caldwell Creek moved around them, horses at the hitching posts, a woman in a blue bonnet arguing pleasantly with the store's owner through the open window, two dogs engaged in a complicated territorial negotiation in the street. "There's a social at the church next Saturday," he said. "Me would probably have told you about it." "She mentioned it," Evelyn said. "Most of the county comes. It's a good way to meet people." "I'll be there," she said. She looked at him. "Will you?" He smiled, then actually smiled, and it changed his face considerably, opened it up, took 10 years off it. "I generally try to avoid them," he said, "but I might make an exception." She walked back to the boarding house with the notebook under her arm and did not let herself smile until she was half a block away, and then she did smile, briefly and privately, and made herself stop. The church social was held on a clear October evening in 1882, in the yard beside the Caldwell Creek Baptist Church, with lanterns strung on lines between the oak trees and tables covered with enough food to feed twice the number of people present. A trio played fiddle, guitar, and harmonica in the corner of the yard, and someone had laid boards over the grass for dancing. And by the time Evelyn arrived with me and Miss Cole, the whole thing was in full swing. She wore the best dress she had brought with her, a deep blue wool with small buttons at the collar, and me had pressed it carefully, and she had put her hair up the way she used to, before she stopped caring about her appearance during the worst weeks after the engagement collapsed. She looked, she decided, in me's small mirror that morning, like herself again. Not the Evelyn who had walked out of the Philadelphia house carrying her trunk, pale and dry-eyed, but the Evelyn she had been before all of that, or maybe a different version of her, one who had been somewhere and come back changed in ways that were not entirely bad. Ira Brooks arrived an hour into the social. She saw him before he saw her, which gave her the advantage of composure. He was wearing a clean white shirt, and his hat was the same, but he'd clearly given it some attention, and he moved through the crowd of people with the same economical ease he moved through everything, stopping to speak with people in the brief, honest way of someone who is genuinely liked rather than merely popular. He found her eventually, standing near the food tables with me and a rancher's wife named Mrs. Garrett, who was telling a very long story about her apple trees. He appeared at Evelyn's elbow as naturally as if he had always been there. "You came," she said. "I said I might," he said. "You also said you generally try to avoid them." "I made an exception," he said, and met her eyes, and the directness of it was not aggressive or flirtatious. It was simply honest, and she found honesty, after the month she had spent surrounded by its deliberate absence, almost startlingly beautiful. They danced twice. He was not a particularly skilled dancer, which she found preferable to the polished, practiced dancing she had grown up with in Philadelphia, because at least there was nothing performed about it. He held her with the careful courtesy of a man who was very conscious of where his hands were, and she found that she did not mind his hands exactly where they were. Between dances, they walked to the edge of the lantern light and stood near the oak trees and talked. She asked him about the ranch, how long he had run it, what it was like to build a thing like that from nothing. He had come to Texas in 1873, he told her. He had been 22 and had started with a small land claim and $140 and 2 horses. He had worked as a hand for other ranchers for 2 years while he fenced his own land and built the first walls of the house, and he had built the herd slowly, year by year, and lost cattle to drought and disease and recovered and kept going. The 2 hired hands he'd started with were now 3 permanent ranch hands and Pete, who was 19 and learning everything as fast as he could. "You built all of it yourself," she said. "With help," he said, "but yes." "That's remarkable," she said, and she meant it without any condescension, and he seemed to understand that she meant it without any because something relaxed in his shoulders. "It's what you do out here," he said. "You work with what you have." "That seems like a good philosophy for more than just ranching," she said. He looked at her. "Where are you from originally, before Philadelphia?" "I was born in Philadelphia," she said. "Lived there my whole life. And now you're here." "And now I'm here," she said. "Do you mind it, being here?" She considered the question seriously, the way she considered all serious questions. She looked up at the sky above the oak trees, which was enormous and black and white with stars in the way that the Philadelphia sky had never been. "I thought I would," she said. "I was angry when they sent me. I'm still angry, honestly. About the reasons they sent me, about the way they did it." She paused. "But I don't mind being here. I think I might like it. I think this might be the most honest place I have ever lived." He was quiet for a moment. "It's an honest kind of country," he said, which was almost exactly what he had said in the stagecoach, and it landed differently now in the dark under the stars, with the fiddle playing behind them and the lanterns swinging in the oak trees. "You said that before," she said. "On the horse." "I meant it both times," he said. They stayed at the edge of the lantern light longer than was probably strictly proper, and me caught Evelyn's eye twice from across the yard, with an expression that was entirely neutral and entirely knowing, and Evelyn looked away both times without changing her expression. When the social began to wind down and people started collecting children and hats and shawls, he walked her back to the tables and found me and said a courteous good night and put his hat on and walked to where his horse was tied. She watched him go, and he did not look back, and she found that she was fine with that, because it suited him. She told me, walking back to the boarding house, that she thought she might go back to the schoolhouse on Sunday to prepare for the coming week's lessons. Me said, "Mom," in a way that made it absolutely clear she had noticed everything. Over the following weeks, Evelyn ran into Ira Brooks with a frequency that could not be entirely attributed to a town of 400 people, because she noticed that she tended to be in certain places at certain times, and that he tended to come to town on Saturdays, and that the general store and Me's kitchen and the social events of Caldwell Creek had a way of providing opportunities if you were not actively avoiding them, and neither of them was. He brought her a book in early November. He arrived at the boarding house on a Saturday morning with a volume of Mary Shelley's essays that he had somehow tracked down from a bookshop in Amarillo, and he left it with me because Evelyn was at the schoolhouse, and me brought it to her that evening with another of those entirely neutral and entirely knowing expressions. Evelyn read the whole thing in 2 days. She brought him a note through me. She was not yet in the habit of going to the ranch herself, though the reason for that particular restraint was becoming less clear to her. And the note said that the essays were excellent and asked whether he had read anything else by Shelley, and could she recommend Frankenstein if he had not, because the novel was extraordinary. He appeared at Me's the following Saturday with Frankenstein already in hand. He had found a copy in Amarillo, which meant he had gone to Amarillo specifically, and they sat at Me's kitchen table for 2 hours reading different sections and pointing things out to each other, and getting into a genuine argument about whether Victor Frankenstein was primarily a figure of tragedy or primarily a figure of self-indulgent irresponsibility. "Tragedy," he said. "He was trying to do something extraordinary and it destroyed him. He was trying to play God and it destroyed the people around him," she said. "There's a difference. You think there's no tragedy in that." "I think tragedy is not the same as victimhood," she said, And I think we spend too much time sympathizing with the men who make choices and not enough time thinking about the people who have to live with the consequences of those choices." He looked at her. There was something in the look that was new, the same attentiveness he always had, but warmer and more direct and slightly less contained. "That's a sharp thing to say," he said. "It's something I know personally," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Gerald Holt," he said. It was not a question. Me must have told him something, or perhaps Evelyn had said enough in small moments for him to piece it together. She felt a brief flash of self-consciousness and then let it go, because she was done being self-conscious about a situation that was not her fault. "Gerald Holt," she confirmed, "who is in Philadelphia living his life completely unaffected, while I have been sent west to disappear quietly and stop embarrassing my family." The expression on his face was not pity. She was relieved about that. It was something steadier and more contained, something that looked like it could become anger on her behalf if she wanted it to, but was holding itself back out of respect for her own handling of the situation. "Do you plan to disappear?" he asked. "I never planned to," she said. "I just hadn't quite decided what I was going to do instead. And now," she looked at him across the kitchen table in the warm light of Me's lamps, with the Texas November wind moving against the windows. "I'm working on it," she said. He smiled. The full one with the 10 years. By December they were meeting intentionally and saying so openly. He rode into town on Saturdays and she was at Me's, and they would take a walk along the creek at the edge of town, or on cold days stay in Me's parlor, since Me had made it clear that they were welcome, and they talked for hours about everything and nothing. Books and the land and the children she was teaching and the cattle markets, and what it had been like to be 22 and come to Texas with $140, and what it had been like to be educated in Philadelphia in all the ways women were educated in Philadelphia, and then to discover that the education primarily prepared you to be an ornament in someone else's house. "I wanted to be a doctor," she said one Saturday, which was not something she had told anyone in a very long time. "When I was young, I read everything about medicine I could find." "Why didn't you?" he asked. "Women don't do that," she said in a voice that was not quite her own, an imitation of the voices that had told her so repeatedly through her whole childhood. He was quiet for a moment, watching the creek. It was a cold day, the air clear and thin, the sky the color of pewter. "What did you actually want to do with your life?" he asked. "If you could have chosen anything." She thought about it honestly. "Learn everything," she said. "Teach it. Make things make a place. Be somewhere that was mine." She paused. "I think I wanted what you built. I just didn't know I could want that for myself because no one told me it was allowed." He looked at her. The quality of his attention was, she had learned, something that operated differently from the attention of other people. Most people looked at you and saw what they expected to see. Ira Brooks looked at you and saw what was there, and the distinction was, when you had spent 24 years living with the former, almost overwhelming. "It's allowed," he said. "I know that now," she said. "I'm just learning how late I've arrived to the knowledge." "You're 24, he said. "That's not late." She looked at him. "How old are you?" 31. "And you've known for a while that it was allowed," he considered. "I've known that I had to decide for myself what was allowed," he said. "I didn't have many people telling me what I could or couldn't do. I had very little and I had to figure out what I wanted to do with very little. That's a different kind of freedom, but it's still a kind of freedom." She thought about that. The freedom of having nothing to lose. She had had everything, every comfort, every social advantage, every carpet and curtain and piece of silver plate, and she had had no freedom at all. He had had nothing and had built everything he had exactly the way he wanted to build it. "I think," she said slowly, "that I am going to like who I become out here." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the creek. Then he said quietly, "I think I like who you are already." She did not say anything. The wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek, and the pewter sky held still above them, and she felt the warmth of what he had said settle somewhere in the center of her chest and stay there. She went home to Me's and opened her notebook and wrote for an hour. She did not write about Gerald Holt or Philadelphia or her father's study or any of the things that had brought her here. She wrote about the creek and the cottonwoods and the sky and a man who had said he liked who she already was, and the way that sentence was the loudest quiet she had ever heard. Christmas in Caldwell Creek was simple and warm. Me decorated the boarding house with pine boughs cut from a tree that old Sam drove 2 hours to find, and the church held a service on Christmas Eve that the whole town attended, the building so full that people stood in the doorway in their coats against the cold. And afterward there was a gathering at the saloon that was somehow entirely respectable, because the whole town came, and the children chased each other between adults' legs, and someone played the piano and people sang. Ira was there. He had brought a small gift for me, a smoked ham from his ranch, and he had brought something for Evelyn as well, a slim leather-bound journal, nicer than the notebook she had bought at the general store with her initials pressed into the cover. She looked at the initials for a long moment. Nobody had given her something with her initials on it since she was a child. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She looked up at him. They were standing slightly apart from the rest of the gathering, near the window, the piano music and the conversation filling the room around them. "Ira," she said, and she meant to say something after his name, something articulate and measured. But instead she just held the journal against her chest and looked at him, and he looked back at her. And the thing that was between them, which had been building since the stagecoach, since the first evening at his ranch, since the church social and the kitchen table and the creek and every Saturday in between, was suddenly, for the first time, something they were both fully looking at instead of politely looking near. "I'd like to take you to dinner," he said, "properly, not at me's, not at a social, just the two of us." "The hotel dining room," she said, "if you'd like." "Next Saturday," she said. "Next Saturday," he agreed. The dinner at the Caldwell Creek Hotel dining room was, by objective standards, not extravagant. The menu was limited beef, which was plentiful in the panhandle, and biscuits and roasted vegetables and a dessert made from dried apples. But the room was warm and the light was good and the tablecloths were white linen. And she wore the blue dress again, and he wore his good white shirt and a jacket she had not seen before, dark wool, fitted properly. They talked through the whole meal, which ran 3 hours, and she did not notice the time until a waiter came by to quietly indicate that they were the last guests in the room. He walked her back to the boarding house through the cold January air. She could see her breath. The stars were out in their full Texas abundance, and their boots made the same sound on the frozen ground, and she was aware of how close his arm was to hers. At the gate of the boarding house he stopped, and she stopped, and they faced each other in the starlight. "I need to say something," he said. "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment, gathering the thing. She waited. She had learned his pauses and knew they were not hesitation but assembly. He arranged what he meant before he said it, because he meant what he said. "I know you were sent here," he said. "I know it wasn't your choice, and I know it wasn't fair, and I know that being here wasn't, at the start, something you wanted. And I'm not asking you to feel about this place or about anything here in a way that you don't feel." He paused. "But I'd like you to know that what I feel about you is not casual, and it is not simple, and I would rather say that plainly than let it be the kind of thing that stays unspoken until it goes wrong." She looked at him for a moment. His breath was visible in the cold air, small clouds of sincerity. His eyes were dark and steady and entirely serious. "I don't do anything casually either," she said. "I should tell you that since we're being plain about things, I'm not someone who behaves carelessly with her feelings or anyone else's." She paused. "What I feel about you is not casual, and it has not been simple since the horse." Something broke open on his face then, not dramatically, but the way ice breaks on a creek in the first week of March, a cracking and a release, and beneath it something moving and alive. "Since the horse," he said. "You said Song of the Open Road," she said, without hesitating. "Yes." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back that had come loose from her hat, and his fingers brushed her cheek with the careful deliberateness of someone who had thought about doing exactly that thing for quite a long time, and she held very still in the cold starlight and let him. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes," she said, which was not an answer to anything he had asked yet, but which was the correct answer nonetheless. He kissed her gently in the January cold outside me's boarding house gate, with the stars enormous above them and the town quiet all around, and it was not the kind of kiss she had experienced before, which had been skilled and performed and ultimately hollow. This was the kind of kiss that meant what it meant, nothing more or less, and it meant very much. She went inside afterward and did not write in the journal because she did not want to reduce the thing to words yet. She lay in the bed under the blue and white quilt and looked at the ceiling and felt something moving in her chest that she recognized, eventually, as the specific sensation of being exactly where you were supposed to be. Winter eased into February, and February was hard that year. A cold snap that came down from the north and froze the creek solid and lost Ira 6 head of cattle to the cold, and kept him at the ranch for 2 weeks with almost no ability to come to town. He sent a note through Pete, who made the ride into town on supplies day, and Evelyn wrote back, and they maintained a correspondence in the way people did when the land and the weather made distance a reality that had to be worked with rather than wished away. His letters were not long, but they were exactly like him, careful and honest and occasionally surprising. He wrote about the cattle and the land, and the way the ice looked on the creek at his ranch, the cottonwoods gone gray and silver with frost. He wrote about the book he was reading by lamplight in the evenings. He wrote in one letter near the end of February, "I think about you more than is probably conducive to efficient ranch management. I want you to know that I find this acceptable." She read that sentence 3 times and then put the letter away safely in the journal. She wrote back, "I find it acceptable as well. The children are reading Robinson Crusoe. Young Thomas Hendricks has decided he would like to be stranded on an island. I have not told him about the loneliness." The freeze broke in the first week of March, and he rode into town on the first Saturday after, and she was waiting at me's. And when he came in through the back door of the kitchen, she had the coffee already on, and he sat down at the table, and she brought him a cup and sat across from him, and they looked at each other across the table in the morning light. "Hello," she said. "Hello," he said. "You look tired," she said. "Hard weeks," he said. "But it's over. The herd's all right." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that for a while with the coffee and the morning light. It was around this time that a development in Caldwell Creek began to demand attention that Evelyn had not anticipated. A man named Reuben Farrow, who operated one of the 2 saloons on the main street, had been quietly pressuring the town council about the schoolhouse. Specifically, about the cost of maintaining it, which he claimed was drawing from funds that could be better spent on improving the roads between Caldwell Creek and the cattle route to the east. 2 of the 3 council members were sympathetic to Farrow, who was a large economic presence in the town, and there were genuine discussions being had, Evelyn learned from Miss Cole, about reducing the school's operating hours and possibly eliminating the younger grades altogether. This was, Evelyn thought, outrageous. She said so to me. Me agreed with her completely and told her so, and then added that saying it was outrageous to me in the boarding house kitchen was not the same as doing something about it. "I know," Evelyn said. "What does the council respond to?" "Money and numbers," me said, "like any group of men with a budget." Evelyn spent a week putting together a document. She counted every child in the school, 42 of them. And she counted the families those children represented, and the economic connections those families had to the town and the surrounding ranches, and she wrote up a clear and honest argument for the role of the schoolhouse in the stability and future of Caldwell Creek, using logic and numbers rather than sentiment, because logic and numbers were what the situation called for. She showed the document to Ira on a Saturday. He read it in 15 minutes and looked up. "This is good," he said. "Is it convincing?" "It convinced me, and I was already on your side." He tapped the document. "The economic argument about families staying in the area is the strongest. You need to deliver this to the council meeting." They allow public comment. They will once you ask me to tell them they're having a public comment section, he said. Me told them precisely that, and 3 days before the March Council meeting, Evelyn stood up at the front of the town hall, a room full of ranchers and merchants and wives and parents, because me had also told the town about the meeting and what it concerned, and she read her document aloud in the clear, carrying voice of someone who had spent 4 months reading to 42 children in a room with bad acoustics. She was nervous. She did not show that she was nervous, because she had a great deal of practice not showing things, and because in this case what was underneath the nerves was something much larger and much more certain than the nerves themselves. She spoke for 20 minutes. The room was quiet while she spoke. When she finished, there was a long pause, and then old Sam, who never said much of anything, said loudly from the back of the room, "That's right," and several people seconded it, and Reuben Farrow looked at the two sympathetic council members with an expression that indicated he understood the room had shifted. The vote to maintain the school's full operation passed 2-1. Afterward, outside the town hall in the March evening, Ira found her in the crowd. She was still carrying the document, slightly crumpled now from where she had gripped it during the speech. "Well done," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that was not merely congratulatory, something that was looking at her the way he had looked at the Whitman, with the care of someone for whom the thing mattered. "I was terrified," she said, which was the first time she had admitted being terrified about anything in a very long time. "You didn't sound it," he said. "I never sound it," she said. "It's both useful and occasionally exhausting." He laughed, and the laugh was new. She had not heard him really laugh before, and it was unguarded and warm, and she filed it away next to the full smile. In April, the wildflowers came. Texas in April, she discovered, was something that no amount of reading or description could have prepared her for. The plain around Caldwell Creek became blue and red and yellow and orange almost overnight. Bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush and black-eyed Susan stretching in every direction. And the sky was the particular blue of a clear high-altitude day, and the air smelled like something alive and newly born. He took her for a ride on a Sunday afternoon. She had her own horse now, a steady bay mare that Me's stable man had found for her, which she had named Frances after a graytant who had been the only truly interesting woman in her family, and they rode out into the blooming plain and stopped on a low rise and looked at it. She had been in Caldwell Creek for 7 months. "I want to ask you something," Ira said. His horse stood easy beside Frances, and he was looking at the plain, not at her, which she understood was how he handled the things that were difficult to say directly. "Ask," she said. "I want to ask if you're staying," he said. "Not because of any reason outside yourself. Just whether you want to stay in Caldwell Creek." She looked at the wildflowers. She thought about Philadelphia, about the house with the carpets and the curtains and the silver plate, about the study door and the word problem. She thought about her sister, who she had not heard from and who had probably tried to write and been prevented. "I'm staying," she said. "I decided that in February." He looked at her then. "Good," he said, and the word carried the weight of a much longer thing that he was choosing, characteristically, not to elaborate, and she appreciated the restraint and understood what was under it. "I want to ask you something now," she said. "Ask," he said. "The books on your shelves," she said. "When you built the house, did you put them there first or last?" He considered. "Third," he said. "First the walls, then the fireplace, then the books." "Why third?" she said. "Because the walls and the fireplace keep you alive," he said, "and the books make it worth being alive." She looked at him for a long moment in the April sunlight with the wildflowers going on forever in every direction. "Ira," she said. "Evelyn," he said, and the way he said her name, she had noticed this from early on, was different from the way other people said it. Most people said Evelyn the way you read a label. He said it the way you said something you were glad existed. "I love you," she said. It was the most direct thing she had ever said to anyone, and she said it the way she had learned to say things out here, plainly, without ornament, because the truth was better that way and the land had taught her that. He was quiet for exactly one beat, and then he said, "I love you," and it was simple and complete, and there was no hesitation in it, and she believed it absolutely. He reached over from his saddle and took her hand, and they sat on the rise in the April sun with the wildflowers below them, and held hands like two people who had both arrived at this particular point by hard and indirect routes, and were genuinely glad to have made it. The question of marriage came up naturally. The way things between them came up naturally, not as a dramatic announcement or a formal proposal, but as a conversation that began one Saturday in May at Me's kitchen table and ended with them both understanding that it was what they both wanted. He asked her properly, regardless, because he was someone who believed that wanting things properly meant doing them properly. He did not have a ring. What he had was a small piece of turquoise that he had carried since he came to Texas, which he had found in the dirt of his original land claim on his first day there, and kept because he found the color remarkable, and he gave that to her on his knee on the floor of Me's parlor on a Saturday afternoon in May, with Me very tactfully in the kitchen producing a great deal of unnecessary noise with pots. "I have no ring," he said. "I can get one in Amarillo." "I don't want a ring from Amarillo," she said. She looked at the turquoise, which was small and perfect in the precise blue of the Texas sky. "I want this." "It's a rock," he said. "It's a rock you found on the day you started building something," she said. "I want that." He closed her fingers around it. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said. Me came into the parlor 5 minutes later with coffee that no one had asked for and said with great dignity that she supposed she ought to start planning the wedding supper. They were married in June in the Baptist church in Caldwell Creek on a morning that was clear and still and already warm by 9 o'clock. Miss Cole and Me stood with Evelyn, and Ira's 3 ranch hands. Tom, Marcus, and Pete stood with him, which Pete seemed to find deeply gratifying. 40-some people from the town filled the church, including every family with children in the school and old Sam, who arrived first and sat in the front row and wore a clean hat. Evelyn wore a dress that Me and Miss Cole had helped her make over 3 weeks, cream-colored muslin with small blue flowers embroidered at the collar, simple and well-fitted and entirely hers, nothing borrowed from another life. She carried a small bunch of wildflowers that Pete had collected that morning from the plain, slightly chaotic and extremely beautiful. Ira stood at the front of the church in his good jacket and the white shirt, and he turned around when she came down the aisle, and the expression on his face was the fullest and most unguarded she had ever seen from him, all the containment gone, just exactly what he felt, which was enormous. The ceremony was short. The vows were the ones from the Book of Common Prayer, which she had read before and knew, but they were different to say aloud with him in front of her holding both her hands, and she said them in the clear carrying voice, and meant every syllable down to her bones. Afterward there was a supper at Me's long tables in the yard, food enough for the whole town, the fiddle player and the guitar player from the church social playing in the corner, and the evening light coming in gold and warm over the panhandle, and turning everything gentle and beautiful. She danced with her husband, and he was exactly as uncertain a dancer as he had been at the church social, and she did not mind at all. Pete drank slightly too much and made a speech that was earnest and rambling and eventually charming. Old Sam ate 2 plates of everything. Miss Cole cried, which she claimed was on account of the music. Me did not cry, but she hugged Evelyn with both arms for a long time before the dancing started, and Evelyn hugged her back and thought about how this woman, who had taken in a problem sent west to disappear, had become one of the most important people in her life, and she meant to make sure Me always knew that. She and Ira rode out to the Double B in the late evening, under a sky full of stars, and she sat in front of him on his horse the way she had the very first time, except now she leaned back against him instead of holding carefully away, and his arms were around her with the reins, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing that needed to be said, and the silence was the good kind, the kind that was full instead of empty. The ranch was quiet when they arrived. The hands had stayed in town for the celebration. The horses were in the barn, and the lamp in the main room was burning low, left there by Pete before he'd gone to town, and the house smelled like wood and the good clean smell of the Texas plain coming through the open windows. She stood in the main room she had stood in 9 months before as a stranger waiting for supper, and looked at the books on the shelves and the stone fireplace and the wooden table, and then she looked at her husband, who was watching her from the doorway with his hat in his hands. "Hello," she said, which was what she had said in February across the coffee table, and he smiled the full smile. "Hello, Mrs. Brooks," he said, and she found that hearing her name like that, not the name she had been sent away under but the name she had chosen, by the choice she had made, was something that settled in her chest like the last piece of a very long puzzle. She put her hand on the spine of the Whitman on the shelf. "Read me Song of the Open Road," she said. He took the book from her and opened it, and they sat together on the bench by the fireplace with the lamp burning and the Texas night coming in through the windows, and he read to her in his quiet, unhurried voice, and she listened, and the open road went on forever in every direction. Life on the Double B had its own rhythm, and Evelyn learned it the way she had always learned things, by paying close attention, and by asking questions, and by being willing to be wrong and correct herself and try again. She kept teaching at the schoolhouse through the fall, riding Francis in each morning and back in the afternoon, and she and Miss Cole developed a genuine partnership in the classroom and a genuine friendship outside it, and the school expanded its hours by the end of the year because the number of children in the district had grown and the parents wanted more, not less. She learned to cook on a wood-burning stove, which was a genuine education. Me had taught her the basics during the winter and spring, but running the Double B's kitchen was a different thing from boarding house meals, and she made mistakes enthusiastically and corrected them and kept going. By December she could bake bread that Ira ate 3 slices of in one sitting, which she took as a reliable metric of success. She began keeping a formal log of the ranch's expenses and income, because the system that had existed before she arrived was composed mostly of memory and occasional notes in the margin of a feed catalog, and she had a head for numbers and an inclination toward order that she had never previously had a suitable outlet for. Ira looked at the ledger she produced at the end of September with an expression that mixed admiration with slight sheepishness. "It was working before," he said. "It was working in spite of itself," she said. "Now it will work on purpose." He conceded the point. They had their first real argument in November about whether to expand the herd the following spring, which Ira wanted to do aggressively and which Evelyn thought was a greater financial risk than the current market warranted. The argument was blunt and earnest and lasted most of one evening and was resolved, eventually, by Evelyn's ledger numbers, which demonstrated that a moderate expansion was sound and an aggressive one was speculative, and Ira agreed to the moderate position with good grace, and they went to bed not quite with the argument fully concluded, which was uncomfortable, and she lay awake thinking about it and finally said in the dark, "Ira." "I know," he said. He had been awake too. "We didn't finish it right." "No," she said. "You were right about the numbers," he said. "You were right that we need to grow," she said. "I wasn't disagreeing with the direction, just the pace." "I know," a pause. "I'm not used to someone else's opinion being part of the decision." "I know," she said. "I'm not used to my opinion being wanted." They lay in the dark with that between them. "I want it," he said. "Your opinion always, even when it's inconvenient. Even when it's right," she said. "Especially then," he said, and she could hear the smile in it. "Then we're all right," she said. "We're all right," he said. She found out she was expecting their first child in the spring of 1884, when the wildflowers were out again, and Francis was getting too interesting to ride comfortably. She told Ira on a Sunday morning at the kitchen table over coffee, and she told him plainly, the way she told him everything. He set down his cup and looked at her for a moment. His face did the thing where everything showed at once, the contained man entirely gone. "Really," he said, The doctor confirmed it yesterday, she said. October, he thinks. He got up from the table and came around and took her face in both his hands and kissed her with a thoroughness that nearly upset the coffee. And then he sat beside her and held her hand and said nothing for quite a while, which she understood perfectly, because some things were too large for immediate language. I didn't know if I would want this, she said eventually. Before, when I was in Philadelphia, I thought I didn't, mostly because I didn't want the life that was supposed to come with it. She looked at the kitchen, at the stove and the window and the plain beyond it, yellow and blue with flowers. I want this. So do I, he said. I have for a while. You didn't say so, she said. It wasn't mine to say first, he said. It's your body and your life. She looked at him. He was, she thought, the most thoughtful person she had ever known, in the specific sense of someone who actually thought about things before he said or did them, who considered other people's interiority as real and important. I love you, she said. I know, he said. I love you too. He looked at their joined hands. We're going to need another room. We're going to need several things, she said, and pulled the ledger toward her, and they spent the next hour planning, side by side at the kitchen table, which was exactly how she had always, somewhere underneath everything, wanted to spend a Sunday morning. The pregnancy was healthy if frequently exhausting, and Evelyn continued teaching at the schoolhouse until August, when it was no longer practical, and she handed off her students to Miss Cole and a new assistant that the school had hired, a young man named Wallace, fresh from Austin, who was enthusiastic and somewhat chaotic, and who Evelyn privately predicted would be an excellent teacher in approximately 2 years. The baby came in October, as predicted, on a cold and blustery afternoon when the plain was going brown at the edges, and the sky was that particular autumn gray. Ira had ridden for the doctor at the first sign of labor and had returned with him, and had then done exactly what the doctor and me, who had driven out from town, told him to do, which was mostly to be present and quiet, and he was very good at both of those things. The baby was a boy. He was large and red-faced and profoundly opinionated about his arrival in the world, and he cried with an energy that Ira said reminded him of someone. He's loud, Ira said, standing at the side of the bed with his son in his arms, looking somewhat overwhelmed in the best possible way. He gets it from me, Evelyn said, which was funny because she was generally very quiet, and Ira caught the joke and laughed that unguarded laugh. They named him Thomas, after me's late husband, which made me, when she heard, go very quiet in the way of someone who is keeping something inside that is too large to keep entirely inside, and she pressed her lips together and said that it was a very good name, and Evelyn squeezed her hand. Thomas Brooks was, from his first weeks, a person of considerable character. He had dark eyes like his father, and a determination that he clearly got from both of them, and a curiosity that expressed itself loudly and constantly, and that Evelyn found exhausting and delightful in approximately equal measure. The ranch continued. The ledger that Evelyn kept grew thicker and more sophisticated. The herd was expanded moderately in 1884 and moderately again in 1885, and both times the numbers worked out exactly as she had predicted they would, which she did not say aloud more than once. Ira hired a fourth permanent hand in 1885, a quiet young man from New Mexico named Alejandro, who was extraordinarily good with horses and who taught Thomas, once Thomas was old enough to be near horses safely, more about them than any of the adults had managed. Pete, who was 22 by 1885, fell deeply in love with the schoolteacher Miss Cole, which everyone in Caldwell Creek had seen coming for approximately 18 months before Pete himself noticed it, and Evelyn watched the whole process with great affection and some amusement. And when Pete finally arrived at the boarding house to ask me, since Miss Cole had no family in the territory, whether he could court her properly, Evelyn happened to be there, and she told Pete, firmly and warmly, that Miss Cole had mentioned him with a frequency that suggested he should not delay. Pete blushed so severely she worried briefly for his health. Miss Cole said yes to Pete's courtship and to his eventual proposal, and they were married in the spring of 1886, and Evelyn stood with Miss Cole exactly as Miss Cole had stood with her, and it was as good a wedding as the one she herself had had, which was to say it was straightforward and honest, and everyone who was there was genuinely glad to be there. There was a letter from Philadelphia in 1886. It arrived at the boarding house addressed to Evelyn Vaughn, not Evelyn Brooks, which meant her family did not know she had married, which meant they had not been paying attention to her at all, which was, she thought, entirely consistent. The letter was from her sister Clara, not from her parents. It had been written over several months, sections added at different dates, the handwriting varying with the emotional weather of each section. Clara had eventually found a way to send it through a friend in Amarillo, which explained the Amarillo postmark, because their parents had, as Evelyn had suspected, been intercepting her correspondence. The letter said many things. It said that Clara missed her. It said that Gerald Holt had married someone else, and that the family treated this as entirely normal, and had never acknowledged any irony about the fact that the man whose behavior had caused the scandal was the one who continued to move through society without consequence. It said that their father's health was not good. It said that their mother was the same as always. It said, in the final section, written in a different and slightly less careful hand, that Clara had heard from their father's cousin Me that Evelyn was well, and that Clara was glad, and that she would very much like to hear from Evelyn if Evelyn ever wanted to write. Evelyn sat with the letter for a long time at the kitchen table. Then she showed it to Ira, and he read it without comment and handed it back. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "Write to her," she said. "Clara isn't responsible for what our parents did." "No," he said. "I'm not ready to forgive them," she said. "My father especially. I may not ever be ready, and I'm finished pretending that I should feel differently about it than I do." "That seems right to me," he said. "But Clara is my sister," she said. "Write to her," he said. She wrote to Clara that evening, at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up high and Thomas asleep in the next room, and Ira reading in the chair by the fireplace. She wrote 3 pages. She told Clara about the ranch and about Ira, whom she described as the best person she had ever known, and about Thomas, and about the wildflowers in April and the schoolhouse and the enormous sky. She told Clara that she was well and that she was happy, and that she meant both of those things without reservation. She told Clara that she was welcome to write, that her letters should come to Evelyn Brooks, care of Me Draper, Caldwell Creek, Texas, and that Me would make sure they reached her. She told Clara that she did not need saving, and had never needed the kind of saving that required being somewhere out of sight, and that she hoped Clara understood the difference. She sealed the letter and gave it to Pete the next morning to take to Amarillo with the supply run, and then she went back inside and poured herself coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the morning light and felt, as she had felt on many mornings in the 3 years since she had come to this place, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Clara wrote back within 2 months. The return letter was warm and affectionate, and said that she was glad Evelyn was happy, and that Ira sounded remarkable, and that Thomas sounded like a handful, which Evelyn confirmed in her subsequent letter was entirely accurate. A correspondence was established, cautious at first and then more natural, and Clara wrote every 2 months and Evelyn wrote back, and it was not the sisterhood they might have had if things had been different, but it was a real thing and it was good. The years moved with the rhythm of the ranch, and the town and the plain. Thomas learned to walk by hauling himself around the furniture, and fell down a remarkable number of times with perfect equanimity, and got back up, which Ira said was the most encouraging thing he had observed in years. He learned to talk, and then to talk at length, and then to ask questions of a sophistication that regularly surprised them both, and that Evelyn met with the same seriousness she gave the children at school, because she had decided from the beginning that if she was going to raise a child, she was going to raise one who believed his questions were worth answering. Evelyn returned to teaching when Thomas was 18 months old, taking him with her in a basket for the first few months and then, as he became more mobile and opinionated, leaving him in Me's capable care, which Thomas accepted with a cheerfulness that suggested he had inherited his father's adaptability as well as his mother's confidence. In 1887, a drought came to the panhandle. It was not the first drought the region had seen, and it would not be the last, but it was serious. 3 months with almost no rain, the plain going brown and cracked, the creek at the Double B dropping to a thin wire of water that Evelyn watched with anxiety every morning. The cattle were thirsty and the grass was thin, and the financial situation of every ranching operation in the county was under strain. Evelyn ran the numbers carefully throughout the summer. She had been keeping the Double B's accounts for 3 years by then, and she knew the ranch's finances the way she knew the children's reading levels, by careful attention over a long time, not by assumption. She came to Ira in August with a plan for reducing feed costs without reducing the herd's core viability, and a timeline for what they could survive and what would require selling cattle. They talked about it honestly, at the kitchen table, the way they talked about everything. "The core herd is safe through October," she said. "Beyond that we need rain or we start selling." "The rain doesn't run on our schedule," he said. "No," she said, "but the selling can." "You're not worried?" he asked. She looked at him. "I'm worried," she said. "I'm not afraid." He looked at the ledger. "Neither am I," he said, "not with you doing the numbers." The rain came in September, not abundantly but sufficiently, and they did not have to sell the core herd, though they let go of 30 head to ease the pressure, and the autumn was leaner than usual but survivable. And by spring the creek was running full again, and the grass was coming back green and vigorous. And Evelyn added the drought year to the ledger as a closed chapter with the knowledge of everything they had learned from it, which was considerable. Life on the Double B and in Caldwell Creek went on building itself, year by year, the way good things build without drama or spectacle, by the accumulation of small, honest efforts. Thomas at 4 was sharp-minded and physical and deeply interested in horses, which Alejandro encouraged with great patience, and by the time he was 5, he was riding a small, calm pony with a confidence that made Ira look at him with an expression of such unconcealed pride that Evelyn had to look away to hide her own reaction. She found out she was expecting a second child in the spring of 1888. She told Ira the same way she had told him the first time, across the kitchen table, plainly. He got up and kissed her the same way he had the first time, with the same thoroughness. Some things, she thought, did not need to vary. "Thomas will be thrilled," Ira said. "Thomas will be appalled," she said. "He is 4 and very accustomed to being the center of everything." They told Thomas that evening. He was indeed appalled for approximately 3 days and then became fiercely interested in the proceedings, and by the time the baby came in November, he had revised his position to one of profound ownership. This was his baby, his sister or brother, his responsibility, and anyone who thought otherwise had not spoken to Thomas Brooks about it. The second child was also a boy. They named him Samuel. Old Sam had died peacefully the previous winter at an age no one could quite confirm, but which me estimated at somewhere north of 70, and he had been a fixture of both the boarding house and the town for as long as anyone could remember, and the name seemed right. Samuel was, from his first weeks, completely different from Thomas. Where Thomas had announced himself to the world at volume, Samuel was quiet and observant, with enormous dark eyes that followed everything with an expression of serene assessment. Evelyn recognized something in that expression. "He looks at things the way you do," Ira said one evening, watching the baby. "Does he?" she said. "Like he's reading them," he said, "deciding what to make of them before he commits to an expression." She looked at her husband. "You noticed that about me?" "First thing I noticed," he said. "On the stagecoach, you looked at the landscape like that." She had not known he had noticed that specifically. She thought about it. "And what did you think when you noticed?" He considered. "I thought that was a person who was paying very close attention," he said. I thought that was someone who would see things clearly." He looked at her across the kitchen, the quiet baby between them. "I thought that was someone I would like to know." She felt the thing in her chest that she had felt since early on, not the sharp excitement of something new, but the steady warmth of something true, something that had been true for 6 years now and showed no sign of diminishing, only of deepening, the way a creek bed deepens with time. "You found me on the side of a road," she said. "You were reading a philosophy book in the Texas heat sitting on your trunk," he said. "I thought that was either very impressive or very peculiar." "Both," she said. "Both," he agreed. By 1889, Evelyn had been in Caldwell Creek for 7 years. She had been a problem sent west to disappear quietly, and instead she had become something she had not known she was capable of being, not because the West had transformed her, but because it had given her the space to be what she already was without anyone insisting she be less. She still taught at the school 2 mornings a week, which she had negotiated with the current full-time teachers as a balance against her responsibilities at the ranch and at home. She still kept the double B's accounts with the same meticulous care. She still wrote to Clara, and Clara wrote to her, and the correspondence had grown warm and honest, and was, in its way, a more honest sisterhood than they had managed under their parents' roof. Her father had died in 1888. Clara wrote to tell her, carefully. Evelyn sat with the news for a day, and felt things about it that were complicated and that she did not try to simplify. And then she wrote to her mother, the first letter she had written to Philadelphia directly since the train, a brief and formal expression of condolence, because it was the right thing to do. She felt no need to go further than that, and she did not. Her mother did not write back. Evelyn thought about that for less than an afternoon and then let it go, because the life she was living was too full and too good to spend it looking at a closed door. On a Sunday afternoon in the spring of 1889, when the wildflowers were out again, and the sky was the blue it always was in the good weeks of April, Evelyn and Ira rode out onto the plain together while me watched Thomas and Samuel at the boarding house in town. They rode to the low rise where they had sat the first April after she arrived, the day she had told him she was staying, the day they had said "I love you" for the first time. The wildflowers were as overwhelming as always. Bluebonnets and paintbrush and the yellow of some flower she had learned the name of and kept forgetting. The plain going on to the horizon in every direction, the sky enormous above it. She pulled Frances to a stop and Ira stopped beside her and they sat on their horses in the April light and looked at it. "I was going to disappear," she said. "I know," he said. "They sent me here specifically so I would." "I know," he said. She looked at the wildflowers. "I think about that sometimes," she said. "What would have happened if I had just gone to Me's and stayed quietly in the room at the back and let myself be erased?" "You couldn't have," he said. "No," she said. "I couldn't have. I tried. On the train, I tried to decide to be quiet and small and stop taking up space." She looked at him. "I can't do it. I never could." He looked at her with the full attention she had known for 7 years now and still found remarkable every time. "When I found you on the road," he said, "you were sitting in the middle of the Texas plain in the afternoon heat reading Thomas Huxley." "It was all I had to do," she said. "No," he said. Someone else in that situation would have been crying or panicking or standing on the road flagging down help. "You sat down in the shade and opened a book." He shook his head slightly. "You are the loudest quiet I have ever known, Evelyn." She looked at him. The words landed somewhere very particular, somewhere precise. "The loudest quiet," she said. "Everything about you is more than it shows on the surface," he said. "You speak softly and you fill every room you're in. You sit still and you change things." He looked at the wildflowers. "You came here to disappear and you changed this whole place. The school, the council, the ledger, me, Pete, the way I read books." He looked back at her. "Me." She felt her eyes sting, which was unusual for her, and she let it be. "You changed me too," she said. "You were the first person who saw me and didn't decide what I was before looking. You were easy to see," he said. "Once I looked." The horses stood easy in the April sun, and the wildflowers moved in the warm wind, and they sat for a long time without saying anything, which was exactly right, because some moments were better kept than spoken. They rode back toward Caldwell Creek in the late afternoon, the sun behind them and the town ahead, the church steeple visible first and then the rest of it rising from the plain, the shape of the place that was theirs now, completely and without question. Thomas saw them coming from Me's front porch and ran down the street at full speed, shouting something that neither of them could make out until he was close enough, and they could hear that he was reporting, at significant volume, that Samuel had pulled Me's tablecloth off the table, and all the cups had fallen, and it had been extremely exciting, and Me appeared in the doorway with an expression that was mostly amused and slightly frazzled. And Ira lifted Thomas up onto the saddle in front of him, and Thomas immediately tried to take the reins, which Ira allowed in a limited capacity, because Thomas was 5 and entirely convinced of his own competence, and Ira had decided early on that. Confidence like that was worth encouraging carefully rather than suppressing. Inside, Me's kitchen was indeed in a mild state of reorganization, and Samuel was in the center of the room looking entirely self-satisfied, and Evelyn picked him up and he patted her face with both hands and made a sound that was emphatically not an apology. "He's going to be trouble," Me said. "He's going to be wonderful," Evelyn said. "Same thing sometimes," Me said, and went to put the kettle on. They stayed for supper. They stayed most Sunday evenings, the 4 of them, Me included, because she was family in the most fundamental sense. The woman who had received a problem sent West to disappear and had looked at her and said, "What do you need?" And the table was loud with Thomas, and occasionally with Samuel, who at one was developing strong opinions about what he would and would not eat, and the lamp was warm above it all, and the Texas evening came in through the open windows. Ira looked at her across the table at one point, over the heads of the boys and through the noise, and she looked back at him, and they held the look for just a moment, the particular look of 2 people who have been through enough together to know what they have, which is the most valuable kind of knowing there is. She thought, "I was sent here to disappear." She thought, "I have never been more present in my entire life." She thought about the horse, and the turquoise, and the Whitman, and the wildflowers, and the ledger, and the nights talking across the kitchen table, and the way he said her name like something he was glad existed. She thought about the school and the council vote and the letters to Clara and the drought year and the ledger full of careful numbers. She thought about Thomas on the pony and Samuel's enormous eyes. She thought about a man on a gray horse appearing across the plain on a hot afternoon, looking at a broken wheel, and a woman sitting in the shade with a philosophy book, and saying, with perfect economy, "Wheel gave out." She thought about being found, not rescued, not saved, found. There was a difference, and she knew it precisely, because she was someone who had always known the difference between what she needed and what people assumed she needed. And what she had needed was not to be rescued from anything. What she had needed was exactly what she had received, to be seen clearly by someone who was looking, to be given space to be exactly who she was, and to find in this enormous, honest, overwhelming country a place and a life and a person that were entirely, completely, and irreversibly hers. The lamp burned steady above the table. The boys argued about something. Me refilled the coffee. Outside, the Texas night was doing what it always did, going vast and star-filled and indifferent to anything that wasn't the truth of itself. Evelyn Vaughn, Evelyn Brooks, picked up her fork and ate her supper and was, wholly and without reservation, home. Years later, when Thomas was old enough to ask, he asked his mother once how she had come to Texas. She told him honestly. She had been sent, against her will, by people who wanted her somewhere out of sight. "But you weren't out of sight," Thomas said, with the certainty of a child who has grown up watching his mother run a classroom and a ledger and a room with equal authority. "No," she said, "I wasn't." "What happened when they sent you?" he said. She thought about it. "I met your father," she said. Thomas considered this. "On a horse," he said. "On a horse," she confirmed. "And then you stayed," he said. "And then I stayed," she said, "and built something." "With father," Thomas said. "With your father," she said. "And with me and with Miss Cole and with the town and with this land." She looked out the window at the plain which was going gold in the late afternoon light. "With you." Thomas seemed satisfied with this answer. He was 8 by then, and beginning to understand that the world was a more complicated place than it appeared, and he was the kind of child who would keep asking questions until he understood it better, which Evelyn considered his finest quality. Samuel, from the other side of the kitchen, said something unintelligible that nonetheless sounded confident, which was typical of him. He was 5 and had not yet discovered a single opinion he was unwilling to defend. Ira came in from the barn and hung his hat and washed his hands at the basin and looked at the scene in the kitchen, his wife and his sons in the late afternoon light, Thomas still asking questions, Samuel holding forth about something, the supper on the stove, and he stood for a moment in the doorway just looking, with the expression that meant he was fully aware of how good this was and was making sure to see it. Evelyn looked at him. He crossed the kitchen and kissed her at the stove, which made Thomas groan and Samuel shout something that was apparently meant to be encouraging. "Good day," she asked. "Good day," he said. "You." "The children finished Robinson Crusoe," she said. "All of them made it to the end. Even the Hendricks boy," he said. The current generation of Hendricks boys had produced one who was particularly resistant to reading. "Even young Walter Hendricks," she said. "He wants to be stranded on an island." "Of course he does," Ira said. "I told him about the loneliness this time," she said. "He said that's the interesting part." Ira looked at her. "Smart kid," he said. "He is," she said. "They all are mostly, when you give them something worth paying attention to." She turned back to the stove. He stood beside her and looked over her shoulder at the pot and said it smelled good, and she said it would need another 20 minutes, and he said he could wait. And he could, because he was someone who had always known that the best things took time and were worth it. The sun went down over the Texas panhandle in its usual extravagant fashion, all orange and rose, and the kind of gold that made the plain look like something lit from underneath. And the stars came out one by one the way they always did, and the night settled over the Double B, with the sounds of the ranch going quiet and the creek running its steady sound along the cottonwoods, and the horses in the barn making their small settled noises. Inside, the lamp was on above the kitchen table and the supper had been eaten, and the dishes done and the boys were in their beds, Thomas with a book and Samuel already asleep. And Ira sat at the table with the Whitman open in front of him and Evelyn sat across from him with her journal, and neither of them was saying anything. And the silence was the good kind, the full kind, the kind that held everything they were and everything they had made. She wrote in the journal in her clear, steady hand, not a letter and not an observation, but just a fact. "I was sent here to disappear. Instead, I arrived." She looked up at him across the table, and he looked up at her at the same moment, the way people who know each other deeply sometimes look up at the same moment, and they smiled at each other in the lamplight, simply and completely, two people in the life they had built together in this honest, enormous, wild flower-covered country, entirely found, entirely home, entirely enough.